Hi there and welcome to this week's video. I'm your host John Ivison, and this week I am joined by Benjamin Perrin, who is a professor at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia and an author of a new book called Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial. Ben, welcome.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm good. To give viewers some sense of your background outside academia, you acted as Stephen Harper's senior legal advisor in 2012-2013, and I think it's fair to say that you were fully on board with the tough on crime rhetoric, his justice agenda, and the mandatory minimum sentences that he introduced. But as you say in the new book, you're done with that. And in fact, you've produced a manifesto that appears to go off in a polar opposite direction, including abolishing the prison system as we know it. You talk in your book that there was a religious element to what appears to have been a kind of road to Damascus conversion. Was it as dramatic as all that?
I think it was. I mean, in terms of the effect on me, it took more than just that one, flash of light, though. It took time. I was really, very troubled, actually, by the problems I was seeing in and around Vancouver, where I live. This is around 2018. At that point, the unregulated drug deaths were soaring. We had issues of crime and violence in the community. Police were, involved in these shootings of people in mental health distress. It was a really, really dark time, much like it is today, really. And I was really going through my own crisis in my own life. I can only describe as a midlife crisis. I started kind of going back as part of that to my roots. I was raised a Christian, but never even read the whole Bible, if you can believe it. That's many people probably maybe relate to that. And I started just very basically, just every morning waking up, reading a bit of the Bible, praying, and it began to change my heart. And I began to have much more of a desire to learn and hear and listen, and to have more compassion for folks who before I definitely would blame and judge. And so that was the start of it, is that opening, softening my heart. And then as I started in my research to be more concerned about these issues, it took me to some really interesting places, speaking to people I never talked to before and learning a huge amount from them, and it changed my life.
You apologise in the book for your role in supporting a tough on crime agenda, and in particular for the disproportionate impact that had on marginalised communities. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, we know from all the fallout of the tough on crime legislation that it was absolutely borne disproportionately on Indigenous people, Black people, people who are poor, can't afford a lawyer, people who have substance use issues, mental health issues. Our prisons are basically chock full of those folks. One of the things I tell my students in class is, like, if aliens came and were observing us, they'd wonder why some people were caged. That would be they would be curious about that. And based on their analysis, they would not conclude that that's where people who commit crimes go. The reason for that is, in fact, most people who commit crimes never get reported to the authorities. Only a third get reported to the authorities. With crimes like sexual assaults, less than 1% of people who commit a sexual offense end up with any kind of criminal justice disposition, not even a sentence, really. And so it really occurred to me that these policies were not achieving justice. They were not making us safer. And they were hitting people who were already down and out. And the people I interviewed, their stories speak for themselves. I mean, we're talking about people who became addicted to alcohol at age 5, addicted to fentanyl and cocaine and meth at ages 11, 12, joining street gangs at age 9. Like, these are ages of children. I have kids who are those ages, 8, 10, and 12 right now. And my kids aren't doing those things. And it's because they did not have that devastating blows of early childhood trauma and intergenerational trauma that the folks I interviewed experienced. And I'm not talking just about people who commit offenses, people who are victims and survivors too. The system is not supporting and helping them either. So it's really not working for anyone.
So, I mean, you interviewed criminologists, psychologists, lawyers, prosecutors, but also a lot of inmates. What's the inmates' view of prison?
Well, I also talk to corrections officers. It's interesting. Like, no one thinks it's working. No one except for some politicians, really. The bottom line is that when people are incarcerated, particularly in the maximum security prisons at the far end, and the other end is when they're denied bail and they're waiting for trial, there are very few, if any, real effective programs for them at all. The focus is on punishment. These are very traumatizing environments. There is rampant violence. There is hugely disproportionate rates of suicide, of overdose drug deaths, and it goes on from there. So the bottom line is that people who enter these places of confinement leave worse off, and that makes society less safe. And, virtually everyone who's in prison is getting out eventually, and the kind of neighbor that I want to have is someone who's had some healing and some support and has got some vocational training and can move on with a healthier life and has had some healing, not someone who, as I was described, spent the night sharpening their shank and deciding who they're gonna have to defend themselves against the next morning, and then suddenly they're in the community in prison shoes with no ID, with nowhere to live, and we wonder why they end up breaking into vehicles in our neighborhoods.
Right. I mean, you mentioned that they're perfectly conducive institutions for repeat business.
Yeah, it's people say the criminal justice system is broken. I used to think that too. I don't anymore. It's actually perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. It is entirely predictable outcomes. And the other thing that I notice is it's a what's called a positive feedback loop. So we keep applying the same medicine, as it were, which is policing, denying bail, harsher penalties, longer prison terms, those punitive approaches. And we wonder why we get things like rising crime rates, why there's a growing disproportionate number of Indigenous and Black people incarcerated. We're just doing the same thing and it's not working, and we need a totally new approach.
Although one thing that surprised me was that incarceration rates, despite the mandatory minimums and the rhetoric, stayed pretty constant during the Harper government.
You've got largely the same sort of population of people. So if they're either kind of going in and out, or they're just staying longer, it's the sort of story I heard of people who were incarcerated from ages like 12 to 39. And 25 of those years they spent incarcerated. So whether they're spending 1 month, 6 months, or 1 year, whether that's consecutive or you're serving that all at once, the bottom line is you're not getting any better, you're just getting worse, right? So the other problem with mandatory minimum penalties is they're very blunt. They're very blunt instruments, and there absolutely are cases where they achieve outcomes which would be unjust, that are unfair, that don't strike the right balance, as it were. And they also make the false assumption that prison, and only prison, that's what a mandatory minimum penalty is, right? It's that only prison will do. And that's just not the case. I believe our goal of our justice system should not be just to punish people. I believe it should be to make us all safer, and to transform the trauma that not just survivors and victims experience, which is continuing in the current system, but also those people who are harming others, people who are incarcerated. That the goal should be to reduce the overall level of violence in our society, and to do that in a substantial and dramatic way in the short term and as a long-term goal as well. So
Pierre Poilievre, he was in government with you. He's still talking tough on crime, rhetoric like less bail, more jail for repeat violent offenders. You clearly don't agree with that, but there are cases where, like the instance I cited in an article this week, where the OPP officer was murdered by a young Indigenous man who was charged with weapons offences but had been released on bail because of his Indigenous status. He's free and he kills someone. How do you answer that?
Yeah, I think it's a perfect example of the failure of the system. I mean, the system produced that, and the key is, though, it's not just a function of him having been denied bail. The fact is, if he were or granted bail rather, if he were denied bail, then he's going to serve shorter period of time, because when you're on pretrial custody, you still get extra credit for that. You have less access to programs, you're getting out. So if it didn't happen today, it could very well have happened tomorrow. The system is doing nothing to help people like that. When I look at cases like that, these tragic cases, it represents this failure of the system. When we look at them, we look at the justice system like looking through a straw. We're just talking about that one moment in time. I zoom out in this book and I go, where were all the points of intervention for that young man? Where did we start? And typically with Indigenous people who have been caught up in the criminal justice system, we see them at the very end, the critical failure of the system. They've killed someone, this horrific incident. When we pull it back, we see that, in fact, they went through multiple typically earlier periods of lesser incarceration, didn't quote-unquote work. Before that, it was as a youth, often starting as young as age 12, which is shocking, but that's the people we talk to in our research. And before that, very frequently, the pipeline from there was the child welfare system, which, as you know, disproportionately scoops up Indigenous youth still. And so the real origin story of that crime, it reflects typically dozens, if not hundreds, of failed opportunities to intervene at earlier stages to not only save the officer's life, but prevent that young Indigenous man and his family and community from the harm and blowout of the trauma that he no doubt experienced younger in life. So, I want to be really clear, and I do in the book, trauma is not an excuse or a justification for people to cause harm. But if we're serious about addressing harm in society, we have to do the work of addressing the trauma that is at the root of the harm.
But obviously there are root causes, but this thing happened. You're very anti the idea of incarceration. But let's take out the most dramatic case that I can conjure up, and that's Paul Bernardo, dangerous offender. What happens to somebody like him in your system? We're going to come on to what your prescriptions are, but let's just take that case at the moment.
Yeah. So we obviously have to have a place where people go who are a significant risk to public safety. And I also mentioned in the book, and where their crimes shock the conscience of Canadians. So you could imagine a case where someone had a one-time incident, but it was particularly egregious. Like, let's imagine it was a person who was cheated on by a partner and they heinously killed them. But the evidence was that they would, if we believe the evidence, they would never do such a thing again. It was a one-time thing, so they're not a risk. I account for that in the book, and I say, look, at such a heinous offense, they still would need to be separated from society. So I absolutely believe that we should do that. Now, I'll talk about Paul Bernardo, but I want to emphasize that we should not build an entire justice system around extreme cases, okay? Because when we do that, we end up incarcerating people for far, far, far lesser things for far, far longer, and it's because of things like they can't afford a lawyer. And that's most people, okay? So most people in the system, upwards of, depending on who you ask, and I talk to lots of folks, 80 to 90% of people in the system, they're mainly in prison because of mental health, substance use, poverty issues that brought them into contact with criminal justice, right? So when we do separate people, whether it's Paul Bernardo or anyone else, that is the punishment. Okay, so the punishment is that you are no longer able to live out your life. You don't get to decide what you do with your life. You are confined to this place. So I still account for that. But instead of the goal being punishment, because, again, most people are going to be released, and because I also think, I do believe that we should have a sense of humanity even when we are incarcerating the heinous people like Mr. Bernardo, that those should be places where people are actually getting better and not worse. And there's a reason for that even with persons who commit these really extreme crimes. And that's because for all the people who are getting out, which is, again, well over 90% of people are getting out, they should be in a place which the focus is on their rehabilitation and healing. So getting the trauma counseling they never got when they were younger, access to evidence-based substance use recovery, mental health support, getting a job. Almost 2/3 of people in federal prison were unemployed at the time they were arrested, and they're still unemployed 14 years after release. And so that's really the emphasis that I put is about making society safer, protecting us from those people who would harm us, but also ensuring that when they are released, we are actually kept safe.
So turning now to your prescription for making the system better, although in fact you don't even talk about reforming the system, you're talking about overhauling it. You advocate something called transformative justice. It would, among other things, divert resources from police, shut down the prison system as we know it. You can elaborate on some of the other ideas that you have. You've worked in politics. You know how hard this is. How can you possibly enact this agenda? Can you win public support for something like this?
Yeah, so the goal in this book, in sort of part 2 of the book, is to say, look, there is a better way than the flawed status quo. The status quo is not working, and tinkering with it hasn't worked over the last few decades. So we're really wasting our time and our resources if that's all we're talking about is tinkering with the status quo. I would say that's 99% of what is done right now, whether it's in advocacy or academia or even in the media or in parliament, right, or legislatures. So that's one option. The other option is to double down on those tough on crime policies that I used to support. That is in vogue in a lot of parts of the country right now, not everywhere though. And I show in the book how incarceration, we know, increases recidivism. More police is not the answer. There's no evidence. There's actually a new study out this week, a Canadian study, that there's no correlation between bringing in more officers and reducing crime rates. It's, in fact, in some cases, they find the opposite. So if those are the only two options, then we really lack anything else. So that's really the objective of part 2 of the book, is to get people thinking, what else could we do? And I would say the goal, again, why I call it transformative justice, is the goal should be to transform the trauma and harm in our society, both for victims and survivors who are completely neglected for the most part in the current system and under tough on crime, and also to transform that trauma in people who cause harm so they don't continue. We want to break these cycles of harm and trauma and violence that escalate to these horrific cases. So in terms of what hope I hold out, there's sort of 7 key pillars of a new transformative justice vision that I articulate in this book, Indictment. We don't have time to get into it all, but to give a couple of examples, every single one of those 7 pillars is actually, has been implemented, is working, and is getting better results somewhere in Canada or the rest of the world. So I take great hope in that. The other thing I'll point out is not all of them began or are governmental initiatives. They don't actually need political support. So one that I'd focus on would be 24/7 non-police crisis response teams. I profile an organization in Eugene, Oregon that really started this about 20 or 30 years ago now. It's still working. It's called CAHOOTS, stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. These are trained medics, trauma workers, social workers, and they go out in teams of 2, and they are part of the 911 and non-emergency police system. It turns out 15 to 20% of all calls in Eugene, Oregon go to these non-police crisis workers. So this would make a huge difference. It's a better tool to deal with people, for example, who are maybe a homeless person who's waking up and outside of a business. We have a case of this actually in Vancouver. It's in the paper today. The business owner did not want to call police, but they needed to open their store and the person wasn't moving along. So they called the police and now there's a complaint. The allegation is the police immediately began kicking this person, telling them to get a job, that they were lazy. And the shop owner was so horrified, they reported the police to the commissioner, and it's under investigation. Now imagine if we had something like a non-police response team. So instead of being police, fire, and ambulance, you have a 4th option. We have a social worker could come. That social worker comes and says, hey, you know what, it's time to move on. We've got a van, come in, have some warm up, get some food, we can take you to a safer place, get you connected with services. And if you don't, we do have the radio. The police are the only other option. Okay, 99 times out of 100, what they found in Eugene, Oregon, is that initial non-police response works, and it could save lives. Because like 2/3 of people who die in police encounters were experiencing mental health issues or substance use issues. So there are better ways.
Well, I was going to mention that one thing that Pierre Poilievre did say in that famous apple munching video. I'm sure very few people got to this, but about 10 minutes in, he was asked about treatment for substance abuse. And he said treatment is the only answer. And he advocated a centre in Winnipeg which had a sweat lodge component, and it was essentially designed to make sure that people weren't just kicked out in the street, ready to end up back in some institution or other. Do you think that our society is at least becoming partly convinced that throwing sick people in jail is not the answer?
I think that the needle has shifted, although there's some evidence it's moving back a bit, to understand that people who have substance use disorders don't choose to continue to use those things. It's not like you wake up and want to do it. In fact, the definition of a substance use disorder, an addiction, is continuing a certain behavior despite wanting to stop it or do it less. And so we know from the psychology around addiction and how the brain works with someone who has a substance use disorder or any other real addiction, is that decision-making process isn't really a decision. It's not effectively a real choice at this point. So I think society largely has moved on from the idea that these are criminal law problems that need a criminal law tool. However, we do see the pendulum shifting back. One thing I do want to mention about that quote you mentioned, where Mr. Poilievre says treatment is the only answer. That's actually not true, and that's really dangerous. So, what we need to do with the unregulated drug death crisis in Canada is do both things like harm reduction, so providing safe places for people to use, and substituting the toxic drugs with a reasonable substitute, not some other drug that they're not going to use or some less potent drug, but a reasonable substitute. and offering them access to evidence-based treatment. So in the research that I did for an earlier book called Overdose, we found that on average, people had tried various treatment programs 15 times. It's not like you just get to keep trying it, given the current toxic drug crisis. People need to be alive to enter treatment, and the best harm reduction services provide that access and increase the options for treatment as well. So it's a related issue, but at its core, we can debate about how should safer supply work and how should supervised consumption sites work and how do we ensure community safety in the process. Those are really important conversations for people willing to have them. My argument is we need to take out the police and prisons from the system for dealing with substance use issues. Unless someone is physically violent, we should not have any police involvement whatsoever in those scenarios.
One response I got time and again to the piece that I wrote that appeared yesterday on your book was, what about victims? So what about victims? I know you mention it in the book.
Yeah, and in fact, my whole career, has been as a victim advocate. I wrote a book called Victim Law when I was with Prime Minister Harper's office. I was the one who first proposed having a Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights. So I very much profile victims in the book, and fair enough, it's almost a 350-page book. You write in one article, you can't cover it all. But the status quo does not adequately address victims. In fact, I talk about how the research shows, this is incredible, victims are even less satisfied with the criminal justice system than offenders. Isn't that it? That's just wild. So why is that? Well, the system treats them as pieces of evidence, right? People have probably all heard the notion that a crime is a wrong against the state. That is what I describe in the book as the kind of original sin of the criminal justice system, really, towards victims. We need to recognize crime for what it is. It is a wrong against the person who was assaulted, who was robbed, whose loved one was killed. It was a wrong against them. They and their healing needs to be at the heart of how we approach things. And that's why I emphasize the need for transformative justice, providing services to support victims. They still don't have that in many parts of the country, and it's not hardly adequate. When I get into this with survivors, it's absolutely shocking how they're treated by the police in many cases, by prosecutors, even by judges. And they are treated worse than sort of second-class citizens. They're told they have rights, and then those rights aren't respected. They'll submit a victim impact statement, but it doesn't get read. They describe very frequently the secondary victimization of being re-traumatized by being not believed, by being treated with disrespect, as worse than the crimes that were committed against them. I heard that over and over. So does restorative justice have a role to play there? It really does, because at the restorative justice table, you've got the person who caused harm, the person who was harmed. You have a professional. There are literally thousands of people in Canada who are trained as restorative justice practitioners. I mean, it works. Like in the book, I profile the Collaborative Justice Initiative in Ottawa, works at the Ottawa Courthouse, a very small group of people, just because of lack of funding, really. They're constantly trying to get more funding. The track record that they have is incredible. They have higher rates of victim survivor satisfaction. Victims get to participate. They have lower rates of recidivism. And when they've done independent reviews of the restorative justice program in Ottawa, what they found was the only critique of it was it didn't have enough funding. It had inadequate funding. So I argue that restorative justice should in fact be the principal and main way that we deal with conflict in society when both the person harmed and the person who harmed them is willing and interested to participate. So that's clearly a way that we need to move forward, and there's people ready to do it.
And restorative justice, correct me if I'm wrong, but is more of a hallmark of the Indigenous system. You essentially say that Indigenous law should be allowed to operate independently. I mean, I know we have a French civil law system. How would an Indigenous system dovetail with the criminal justice system we have?
Yeah, so it is absolutely critical that as part of this new transformation of how we do justice, both for Indigenous victims as well as for Indigenous people who get incarcerated, we need to recognize the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to their own justice systems. And there's no one Indigenous justice system. Each individual, First Nation, Inuit, Métis nation has their own distinct system. And some of them do, obviously look a lot more restorative than our current system. But, one of the points that I heard from Indigenous lawyers and elders and community members was, don't assume that it's all, soft and easy. There is also, harsh punishments that can get handed out in some Indigenous laws, and we need to respect that as well. And so people shouldn't assume it's an easy out at all. Now, the record of Indigenous justice in Canada in recent times is actually incredible. So if we even look at something like Indigenous peacekeeping, which we would often refer to as like policing, but it's so much different and more than that, they found a 25% reduction in violent crime in First Nations communities that have their own Indigenous peacekeepers. Likewise, Indigenous healing lodges have greater rates of success of reintegration of Indigenous people in the community. And it goes much beyond that. So I really feel like at this point, we've seen that this imposed Western model of justice has failed. It's really done tremendous damage in Indigenous communities. And I heard again and again from Indigenous people saying, we're ready to get in the driver's seat. Now, each individual nation or confederacy is at a very different stage. I heard from some folks saying, look, we're still looking at getting clean drinking water. We don't have time, we're not interested in this, maybe later. But others are stepping up and saying, we're doing it now, we don't need your permission. We want you to get out of the way. And so I firmly believe and expect that we are going to continue to see the growth of Indigenous legal orders in Canada. They exist, they've always existed, and they're being taught in law schools now. You can get actually a law degree at the University of Victoria in Canadian common law, a JD, and a JID, a jurisprudence in Indigenous justice. Just like you mentioned at McGill, where you graduate with a common law degree and a civil law degree. So, I make the point in the book, we already have multiple systems of law in Canada, and we actually already do have two different legal systems. We have a system for the rich and for the poor, for Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So let's not pretend that, we can't have Indigenous peoples, enact their own laws, abide by their own ways, and get the healing that they want for their own communities.
Just to finish off, how is your new perspective going down with your conservative friends? Are you seen as something of a heretic or even a traitor?
It's run the gamut, to be honest. I've seen the whole perspective. I have to tell you, though, there's a lot of people who are very interested in this, and not just quietly. I actually had a chance to meet with some conservative staffers and an MP when I was in Ottawa. The event I hosted on Parliament Hill was co-hosted with Liberal, NDP, Green Party MPs, senators, all that. So it's wide interest from people. I gave a talk at the Fraser Institute on, are we getting good value for our public safety money? That's a great question. Like, why wouldn't we ask that question? Like,
just give us it's $318 a day for an inmate and $1,700 a year. Is that right?
Yeah, it's $116,000 per year per incarcerated person in the federal system. It gets worse, though. So when I mentioned someone a minute ago who was in and out of prison from ages 12 to 39, at 25 years of their life, and if you were to possibly add up the cost as well of all the police encounters, the incarceration, the trial time, all that, I would hazard to lowball it. You're looking at least $5 million, at least, just on that one person, and to no effect. Like, it did not help them. They're incredibly harmed and damaged by the system. They continue to be under long-term conditions that they not use substances that they've been addicted to since they were a child, like literally a child. And no one's better for it, right? So whether the arguments are grounded in human rights, whether it's a fiscal argument, whether it's a faith-based argument, whether it's a reconciliation argument, all of these for me point in the direction that there is actually a new and better way to do things than we're doing now. And we as a society have a choice. We have a choice to continue down this Victorian era road of locking people up to make them change their behavior and throwing more money at these social problems with policing tools that doesn't work, or we could follow a new approach, which I would describe as, again, transforming trauma, that's more compassionate, that is evidence-based. And that's what I firmly believe is the way that we need to follow forward.
Thanks very much for chatting, Ben. Thanks for sparking the debate, and good luck.
Thank you.